Hi, and thank you so much for joining us for our first session of our Spring Cooking Swap series. You might have heard me talking a little bit about this over the last several weeks. My name is Kelly Burgess, and I'm the Family and Consumer Sciences Extension Agent with the University of Kentucky Cooperative Extension Service here in Allen County. So my goal for today is to refresh or revamp a couple of our family's favorite recipes. So I've chose chicken and dumplings and peach cobbler to refresh and show you a little bit of a way to make them more nutritious and healthier in ways that are equally as tasty. So I know that we all have our family favorite recipes, but we sometimes have to alter recipes to be more healthy or to accommodate the needs of certain family members or friends. So over the course of this series, I will be showing how to refresh recipes with different focuses in mind. So today we're focusing on Carb Smart. So we'll be talking a little bit about carbohydrates, and I'll point out why these recipes would be considered Carb Smart and how you can refresh some of your other recipes to also be Carb Smart. So anyways, I would like to go ahead and share my screen with you. I have a little bit of nutrition information to talk about before we get started with our cooking today. So if you'll bear with me one moment, I'm going to share my screen and we are going to go ahead. So we should be rolling. So like I said, welcome to Spring Cooking Swaps. I'm also a registered dietitian nutritionist. So I love talking about our favorite foods, how we can make them healthier and more enjoyable for everyone. So let's go ahead and jump in by talking about the basics of what is a carbohydrate. So carbohydrates are one of our main macronutrients. So macro means big. Nutrients are things that give our body fuel and energy. So we have carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. So carbs are one of the main ones. They're the ones that give us our quick energy. So when you're feeling like you need a little pick-me-up, a carbohydrate is a great thing to grab for. We also refer to several different types of foods as carbs. So things like breads or pastas or rolls, they do contain carbohydrates, but sometimes they're referred to as carbs as well. And the main thing that all carbohydrates have in common is that they're broken down into sugars during the digestive process. So your body takes the foods that we eat and breaks it down into sugars, which is the form that different organs in your body can use. Another thing that all carbs have in common is that one serving of carbohydrates is 15 grams. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. And the last thing to know is that carbohydrates are things that are starchy and things that are sweet. So it's not just our cakes and pies, it's also our potatoes, corn, and things like that. So I'll go ahead and swap my slide. So how many carbs do I need? A lot of people, you might hear about low carb diets or cutting back on carbs, but carbohydrates are actually your body's preferred source of fuel and energy. So that means that our bodies need 45 to 65% of our daily energy to come from carbohydrates. Does that surprise anyone? It seems like it's a little bit high, but when you think about all of the functions that they serve in our body, which we'll talk about in just a moment, it's not surprising that we need so many of them. So I've broken it down a little bit based on your standard 2,000 calorie diet, which we know everyone has different needs, so it won't be the same for everyone. Whether you're older or younger, male or female, can change your needs. But in general, 2,000 calories is a good reference range to start with. So for that 2,000 calorie range, we're looking at 225 to 325 grams of carbohydrates per day. And that translates to about 900 to 1,300 calories. So as you can see, that's a significant portion of our daily energy needs coming from carbs. It's also important to vary the source of our carbohydrates. So as you can see on the slide, there's strawberries, there's corn, there's milk and dairy. So we don't want all of our carbohydrates to come from the same place, because even though they do all break down into sugars, they all have different nutrient packages to offer us. But they do, even all of the different types of carbohydrates, that 15 gram serving has generally the same impact on our blood sugar levels, no matter what food it's coming from. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So I mentioned that carbohydrates are really important in our body's day-to-day functioning. So what do? We know that they provide energy, but one of my favorite fun facts to bring up is about our brains. So our brains depend completely on glucose to run and for energy. And just your brain alone requires about 120 to 130 grams of carbohydrates per day. So you might hear about some low carb diets that say, let's try less than 100, let's do 50 grams of carbohydrates per day. But for most people, that's not super healthy because we're actually depriving our brains of the energy of this in the source that it needs, of the type that it needs. Our bodies can make sugars or glucose out of other sources of food and energy, but the easiest and the most preferred source is carbohydrates. So as I mentioned, your body breaks down carbohydrates into glucose, and carbohydrates are the easiest macronutrient out of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins to be broken down into energy for your body. Okay, so there is such a thing as too many carbs, or maybe the wrong type of carbohydrates. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Those carbohydrates that we tend to watch out for or try and consume less of are those added sugars. So you'll see that in a special spot on the nutrition label that tells you how many sugars are added. Now, this is different from the sugars that are naturally occurring in foods. So for example, 100% apple juice is going to have a significant amount of total carbohydrates, but they shouldn't be added. There should be no added sugars if it's 100% juice. So it's recommended that we have less than 10% of our total carbohydrates per day coming from those added sugars. So if we go back to the 2000 calorie level, we're looking at less than 200 calories or less than 50 grams of added sugar. So as you can see on the little diagram on your lower right, a 16-ounce orange soda is going to have 58 grams of added sugars. So different foods will have different things. They tend to be snuck in some foods that you might not think of, such as granola bars, yogurt, cereals, even some health foods can have a lot of added sugars. So it's just something to be aware of on that nutrition label. We do want to think about the total nutrient package that we're getting. So some people call the added sugars empty carbohydrates because they don't really add to our feelings of fullness. They give us carbohydrates without giving us a lot of other nutritional bang for our buck. So if we want to maximize our nutrition, we can focus more on nutrient-dense carbohydrates. It's also important not to have too many carbs because of things that we all know about, such as weight gain, diabetes risk, obesity. Having too many carbs can contribute to your risk factors for these different chronic conditions. And we also want to think about our oral health, so our teeth. Those refined sugars tend to have negative impacts on our teeth and mouth as well. Okay, so now getting to the fun part where we get to talk about food. What types of foods have carbohydrates? So there's actually several different foods that have carbs. So fruits, that's a very obvious and probably the first example that you think of. Things like apples, bananas, berries. And these are good sources of carbohydrates. They come with a lot of fiber. They come with a lot of vitamins and minerals that are helpful for our body. So in general, those are pretty nutrient-dense sources of carbohydrates. We also have grains. So things like bread, pasta, rice, crackers, all of those things are carbohydrates as well. They come more with B vitamins, and our whole grains will come with fiber as well. A carbohydrate that a lot of people don't think about is dairy. So milk, yogurt, ice cream, some cheeses do have carbohydrates included with them as well. Our starchy vegetables, we mentioned corn, potatoes, beans. Those are some of the more starchy, savory items that also have carbohydrates. And then of course, our concentrated sweets and sugar sweetened beverages are sources of carbohydrates that we want to limit or reduce our intake of. Those are our less nutrient dense, more calorie dense options that don't give us as much nutritional bang for our buck. Okay, so now for the fun part. This series is called Spring Cooking Swaps. So we're talking about how we can make healthy swaps in our favorite recipes to make them just a little bit healthier. So you'll see at the top of your slide, there is a goals section that says it's 3 ways that we can think of when we're altering a recipe. So we can reduce or replace an unhealthy ingredient. We can modify our cooking method, or we can enhance the nutritional value. So you'll see several examples listed on your slide of how we can do that. So I've separated out baking and cooking. How can we add nutrition? So an example of that would be using something like applesauce instead of a fat or butter in your recipe. Using things like applesauce would include, that would up your vitamin and mineral package while reducing maybe an unhealthier ingredient, such as one of those saturated fat foods. For modifying method, that's mostly for cooking. So instead of deep frying, for example, we can bake, we can roast, we can pan sear different items as well. And then enhancing nutrition. So that was kind of what I mentioned with the applesauce example. We can also add vegetables to some of our favorite recipes. So for example, if you have a casserole that's mostly chicken, cheese, and rice, you can add broccoli, you can add green beans, you can add in other vegetables that add bulk so that you get to eat more food basically that helps you feel more full, but you're controlling the amount of carbohydrates that you eat by doing that. So hopefully you've had a chance to look over some of these examples of how we can reduce our added sugar intake and really maximize the carbohydrates that we are eating. So now getting to today's recipe, I promised that we were making chicken and dumplings, which is a Southern favorite. It tends to be a very high calorie, high fat food. So you'll see on the slide, I've created 2 different nutrition facts panels using a computer program called Food Processor. And so I've taken a traditional chicken and dumplings recipe. I like to just look at, Paula Deen or Southern Living or, something that we would all have in our cabinets that would be classic. And you can see the calorie level 580 and the carbohydrates total is 36 grams. So that's not outrageous, but if you'll recall, 1 serving of carbohydrates is 15 grams. So we are between 2 and 3 servings of carbohydrates for this recipe. Now for our easy chicken and dumplings that we'll be making today that come from our USDA My Plate recipe database, I'll share the link to that in the comments of this video when I'm finished. But those easy chicken and dumplings have 220 calories per serving and 20 grams of carbohydrates. So you can see by making some simple swaps, we can really control the amount of carbs and still enjoy our favorite foods. And then finally, I'll go through a nutrition comparison for peach cobbler, which is our other recipe that we're making today. I picked Paula Deen peach cobbler just as an example of a traditional classic peach cobbler. And you will notice that the carbohydrates included in that are 52 grams. But I'll mention not all of those are bad carbs. We do have peaches. So some of our carbohydrates are coming from the fruit itself. And then I compared it to 2 different plated up Kentucky Proud recipes. So you'll notice our plated up logo that we have here. These are recipes that you can find at your local cooperative extension office. And we hope that you come in and check those out. So there's the easy peach cobbler that is more of the dough-based cobbler, the soft cobbler. And then there's peach crisp, which is what we'll be making today, that has more of that crunchy oatmeal brown sugar topping that's also excellent. So we can still include those ingredients that make our foods really tasty. But you'll notice in the plated up peach crisp, there is 32 grams of carbohydrates. So we've gone from almost 3 servings of carbohydrates to just 2. So you'll see by making these easy swaps that we can really still have our favorite foods. And I'm really excited to start to get cooking with you all. So I just wanted to share a few of my resources. If you have questions or you want to learn more about this or contact me with questions, I'll also throw my email address in the link after we are finished cooking today. So now for the fun part that we've all been waiting for, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So hopefully you're able to see the bigger screen now of just me cooking. So we are going to start out with our chicken and dumplings. So I'm going to move this to the side so I can have a little more room. The first step that I want to do is make our dumplings. So we're going to be using 1/3 cup of all-purpose flour, a 1/2 teaspoon of baking powder, and a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. And now that we have these mixed together, I'm just going to use a regular mixing spoon, mix those. And then we'll be adding 2 tablespoons of skim milk. And so we're gonna go ahead and pour that skim milk in there and go ahead and mix it. And this is, I like to just have the dumplings made before we go through the rest of the recipe. That way, when we're ready to add them, it's already good to go. So you'll see we don't need a very big bowl. This recipe makes 2 servings. So if you have a large family or you have kids at home, you might want to double it. But if you are living with just one other person or even by yourself, this would be a great recipe to have where you don't have to have leftovers every day for a week afterwards. So you'll see this has already formed a nice dough, and we won't have to do anything else with that until we're ready for our mixture. So the next step is to do the chicken mixture. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn my burner onto a medium heat and add 2 tablespoons of water and almost 2 tablespoons of flour. Now, if you go look at this recipe after, you'll notice that it says 1/3 tablespoon of flour, but then in the instructions, it says 2 tablespoons. So I went about halfway through the middle and did 1.5 tablespoons of flour. And this is going to be our thickening agent. So something about chicken and dumplings that we all love is that it's creamy. So we want to get that creamy, thick flavor. So we're going to stir this in our pan until all of the flour is not lumpy anymore. We want it to be a thicker paste, but no lumps. So we'll go ahead and mix that. And I wish that you could see through my pan, but it is getting to the point where there are not lumps in here. And I've turned my burner onto about 4. So you can, your stove, you can adjust it to whatever you wish. But once we have that paste that is thicker without any lumps of flour in it, we can go ahead and add our 1 cup of low sodium chicken broth. So you'll notice, even though we're focusing on Carb Smart today, we can also make our recipes healthier by choosing low sodium products as well. They're usually available in the same exact place for the same exact price in your local grocery store, but we can have less salt in our diets that way, which is especially important if you're thinking about heart health. So the next step is to wait for this to thicken up. This is a super easy recipe that you can do on a weeknight. It doesn't take long at all. So I will leave that sit for a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and add our salt and pepper. We have just 1/4 teaspoon of salt and a dash, or however much black pepper to your taste. I might have done a little bit more than a dash because I like flavor. I love black pepper. So I'm going to go ahead and wait until this is thickening up a little bit. I'll just go ahead and go over the rest of the steps for this recipe. We have 1 cup of cooked chicken that has been diced. You can really break it up in whatever size pieces you want. To make it easy on myself, I got a rotisserie chicken that was already cooked so that I didn't have to go through the extra process of cooking the chicken before making this recipe. Now you can make it a little bit simpler for yourself by, if you have extra time or you have leftover chicken, you can easily bake a couple of chicken breasts and then have those already shredded up, or maybe you have leftovers from a previous night that you want to add. But I am going to go ahead and add my chicken because my mixture is thickening up nicely here on this medium heat. So I'm going to add my pieces of chicken. Add my pieces of chicken into our mixture. And that's going to start to smell really, really good. So we've added in our chicken. The next step is to wait for it to get to almost a low boil. So we want to see a few bubbles coming up before we add in our dumplings. And these dumplings are really easy because we don't even have to roll them out per se. These are just the drop dumplings. So it doesn't look like a lot of dough, but I promise it does fluff up and increase its volume once it's in our mixture. So while we're waiting for that to get to a little bit higher temperature, we can go ahead and get started on our dessert, which is our peach crisp. So I will be making half of the recipe today because I've already made some so that I can show you what it looks like after it's baked. So the full recipe, I'll tell you the amounts for that. That way, if you go shopping to make this recipe afterwards, you know what you need to purchase. But we have 6 cups for the full recipe, 6 cups of sliced peaches. So if you do home food preservation and you have leftover peaches from last summer, this would be a great opportunity to use those and get a little bit of that summer feel in advance of peaches being available this season. But if you don't have peaches at home, either frozen or canned, you can also find them frozen at your local grocery store. A lot of times frozen fruits are more cost effective than the fresh varieties when they're not quite in season yet. So just something to keep in mind. We'll go ahead and put our peaches right there. And our next step is to mix up our crumb topping. So we have all of our ingredients measured out. We'll need 1/2 cup of quick cook oats. If you want, you could probably use the old-fashioned oats as well. It would just give you a little bit different texture on top of your peach crisp. Yes, okay, so we've got our oats. Next, we have 1/2 cup of brown sugar, and that's packed. We have 1/2 cup of honey sweetened granola. This doesn't have to be any particular brand. If you make homemade granola, you're welcome to use that. But I've just selected a regular store variety of honey flavored granola for our topping. And then we have 3 tablespoons of whole wheat flour. So that's really going to be what holds everything together in our topping. So I'm just going to use a regular spoon and go ahead and mix this around. That brown sugar is probably going to be the most difficult thing to break up. So go ahead and mix that around and get all of your topping ingredients distributed evenly. One thing I didn't mention was that I have already sprayed my pan with nonstick cooking spray. So that's something that you can do in advance before you put those peaches in there to make sure that we don't have any problems sticking when we want to go get our cobbler out. Okay, let's take a quick break from this before we move on, because I have seen a few bubbles come up in my chicken and dumplings. So the recipe says to make 4 dumplings out of the amount of dough that you have made. So it doesn't have to be an exact science. If you make 3, if you make 5, it's no big deal. If you make 4 and you're serving 2 people, then each person can easily have 2 dumplings. But if you make an extra one, that is a-okay. So I'm using my spatula just to get those off. And one thing that I learned when I tried this recipe at first was that we kind of want to keep the dumplings separate in the pan. So if we put them all in the same spot, they're more likely to stick together, which we don't necessarily want if we want individual dumplings. So you might want to just spread them out in your pan. Okay, clean off my spoon to get every last bit out. I've spread them out in my pan. And the last step in the process of making our dumplings is to put on a lid that is tightly sealed for 15 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and watch my time and remember when that is 15 minutes. One thing you'll notice is that I'm using a pretty small pan. Something I found when I made this recipe the first time was that liquid tends to evaporate. So the reason why it says to put that lid on tight is so that all your liquid doesn't evaporate out. So as tempting as it is, don't lift it up, don't check it, just leave it sit for 15 minutes and you'll have wonderful chicken and dumplings. So I'll show you what those look like in a few minutes. All right, so we have got all of the dry ingredients for our peach crisp mixed. So we're going to go ahead and add in 1/4 cup of butter. I'm using a knife because what we're going to do is cut this in. So you might have heard of cutting in butter to something like biscuits or a pie crust. But what that does is just distributes the butter evenly throughout your mixture. So you want that to kind of break up your oats, break up your granola and brown sugar. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it will make your mixture start to get a little bit clumpy. So once we have those clumps forming, that's when we know that we're almost ready to add it to our peaches. So I'm going to kind of swap back to my spoon to get this spread around just a little bit better. So you'll notice a swap that was made in this recipe was using the whole wheat flour and the oats. So the oats really give you some more fiber and the benefits of the whole grain from the whole wheat flour. Those are just things that we can add a little bit of nutrition. We're also, by doing that, we're replacing a less healthy ingredient with a more healthy ingredient. So replacing just regular white flour with something more nutritious like whole wheat flour is something that you can do in a lot of recipes. You can also do the same thing with pasta dishes. So whole wheat pasta is a great swap. Not only will it keep you fuller longer, but it offers you more vitamins and minerals as well. My recommendation for that is to try the thin spaghetti or the angel hair if you're doing, if you're substituting whole wheat pasta for the first time. So it does tend to have a little bit thicker of a texture. And so since it's thicker, you want that thin pasta. You won't really notice the difference as much. All right, so we have our topping mixed up. I'm going to, easy peasy, I'm going to add this on top of my peaches. And if you're making the full recipe, you'll want to use about an 8x8 pan. You can just kind of adjust to whatever you have at home. Thankfully with baking, it's not quite a cobbler or something like this. It's not quite an exact science. All right, so we'll spread that out over the top. Perfect. And then all we have to do is just sprinkle our spices on top. So we get to use a 1/4 cup of chopped pecans. If you like nuts, if you don't like nuts, totally fine. You can definitely leave them off. So we're gonna add those chopped pecans on top. We have a 1/4 teaspoon of ground nutmeg. So I'm gonna sprinkle that on next. Just kind of sprinkle throughout. If you wanna sprinkle it directly from the spice shaker, that works too. We have a teaspoon of cinnamon. So I love cinnamon, so I definitely want plenty of this on mine. And then finally, we have a 1/4 teaspoon of allspice. So these really good flavors, they're gonna add a lot of flavor without adding as much sugar. So those are some of the benefits of using spices as flavorings instead of sugar. You can have that flavor without all of the calories or carbohydrates. So thankfully, we already have one that's done because this has to bake at 350 degrees for 25 to 30 minutes. So we'll pop that in the oven later, but for now, we have a version that is already fixed, already cooked. So I'm gonna plate this up into a nice bowl. And this total recipe makes 9 servings. So you can divide that up. That kind of gives you a clue about how much is the appropriate portion to eat if we're trying to stick to those 220 calories that is on our nutrition facts panel. So we have this awesome peach crisp. And then I will show you our finished chicken and dumplings as well. So I have these already served up in a bowl as well. You'll see that that tends to be, the dumplings love to absorb the moisture. So if you need to, if you're reheating this, if you need to add a little bit more chicken broth and milk, kind of pour over it before you reheat it, that works just great. But our dumplings are getting big inside of our pan, so we're just gonna leave that sit for a few more minutes, but I won't keep you any longer today. Make sure you check out the comments below for the recipe, the links to both of these recipes. And if you're interested, if you like today's lesson and you want to join our spring cooking swap series, you can follow the registration link that I'll also put below. Because we'll have 2 more of these coming up. In May, we'll be talking about lower fat recipes. And in June, we'll be talking about allergy-friendly recipes. So when you register, you have the opportunity to share your family favorite recipe with me. I might choose it to refresh or make some simple swaps that make it a healthier version of your favorite recipe that you love. And if you choose, you'll also have access to a closed Facebook group where you can share with others who are participating how you made healthy cooking swaps at home. So you can share pictures, you can comment, you can tell each other what worked well and what you might have done differently. But thank you so much for joining us for our first installment of Spring Cooking Swaps today. Once again, my name is Kelly Burgess, and you're watching live from the Allen County Cooperative Extension Service. Thanks, and have a great day.